Good evening. Welcome to episode 25 of the Political Mike podcast. This evening, I'm so grateful to have with me a very senior political veteran and political analyst, Mr. Jeff Greenfield. Mr. Greenfield uh, is a veteran, uh, political savvy individual. He is a senior analyst. He was a senior analyst for CNN. He served as its lead analyst for its coverage of the primaries, conventions, presidential debates, and election nights, as well as presidential funerals and Supreme Court confirmation hearings. Mr. Greenfield has also reported on the media culture and trends of cable news network. Though the five-time Emmy Award winner uh, reporter reporting has taken him to locales around the world, from South Africa to Japan to Europe. He is principally known for his coverage of domestic politics and media. He has served as a floor reporter or anchor booth analyst for national conventions going back to 1988. He has twice been named TV Guide's All-Star Team as Best Political Commentator and was cited by the Washington Journalism Review as the best in the business for his media analysis. Before joining CNN, Mr. Greenfield was a political and media analyst for ABC News between the years 1983 to 1997, appearing primarily on Nightline and delivering weekly commentaries for World News Sunday. He was the media commentator for CBS News between 1979 to 1983. Mr. Greenfield has also appeared on William F. Buckley's Firing Line and PBS We Interrupt This Week. He was the anchor of PBS CEO Exchange, a limited run series for 5 seasons. Mr. Greenfield, a native of New York City, graduated with honors from the University of Wisconsin, where he was editor-in-chief of the Daily Cardinal. He is an honors graduate of the Yale Law School, where he was a note and comment editor for the Yale Law Journal. Following law school, Mr. Greenfield worked as a speechwriter in the Senate office and in the 1968 presidential campaign of Robert F. Kennedy. He then worked as chief speechwriter for New York Mayor John Lindsay. Greenfield spent 7 years with famed political consultant David Garth and wrote books and magazine articles as well. He's written many books, some of which include alternative history books, such as If Kennedy Lived, which takes into account specific historical events that would have played out if President Kennedy was not assassinated on November 23rd, 1963. Mr. Greenfield, I'm so honored to have you with me today, sir, and especially in light of so much going on. First of all, I want to get you tweeted on January the 6th that today, which was the day that the Trump supporters had stormed the Capitol building, was the day that Trump became president of the United States.
A joke. Michael,
did you like
that was a joke.
Oh, no.
The point being that after one of Trump's first speeches, Van Jones on CNN said, "This is the day that Donald Trump became president." And it's become a meme. It's become a source of great mockery. Every time Trump says something halfway sane, somebody kind of pointing to Van, today's the day Donald Trump became president. So I understand why you might have been reading that one way, but it was definitely tongue very, 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 very in cheek, as if to say, okay, I now understand that this guy's never going to become president in the sense that a normal president would. So I just wanted to clear the decks on that.
So, in addition to the impeachment trial that took place today, making Donald Trump the first U.S. president to be impeached twice in American history, there's also been some talk of Senator Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz being expelled from the Senate with a 2/3 vote. Do you think that this would make them victims to their base or to Trump supporters?
It's a fantasy. Ted Cruz may be the single most disliked in the U.S. Senate on general personality grounds. Lindsey Graham once said, if somebody murdered Ted Cruz on the floor of the Senate and the trial was in the Senate, you'd get a conviction. He's the kind of person about whom it's even his best friend stand him. But the idea that 67 senators would require, the same as for impeachment, you need 18 senators and every Democrat to expel. It's just like it's a war. So while there's a lot of pushback against the behavior of Hawley and even among their fellow Republicans, there's these two incredibly anxious guys, and Hawley barely the Senate when he started running for president, hinting at running for president. Cruz did the same thing. That's just not going to happen. Um, uh, you know, it's probably the same reason why it will not be convicted when the impeachment trial goes to the Senate. You may find, unlike the first time, when only Mitt Romney among Republicans voted to convict, you may get um, a few Republicans. I think offhand of 5 or 6 that I would not be at all surprised to see vote conviction, possibly including Leader McConnell. But you're not going to get 18 senators to convict Trump unless they find something else that we don't know about yet. And you're not going to find 18 senators to throw those 2 guys out of the Senate. It's just, you know, um, as I said, it's a bridge too far.
So, what was a really big revelation overnight was that sources had confirmed to major news outlets that for now, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell was pleased with the Democrats' push for impeachment. When I heard of that, I thought this was a really fast, cheap way to kind of turn the page from Trump officially, being that with this conviction, he would be barred from running for public office again, um, closing the books on uh, Trump's chances in 2024. In your reasoning, why do you think that Mitch McConnell seems to be open to the idea of, having a conviction for Trump in the Senate, knowing that there could be political backlash from his supporters in the midterms in 2022 and in 2024?
Well, uh, conviction isn't necessary Trump from running again. That's a separate decision. If the Senate were to vote to convict, they take a second vote on what punishment is, and it requires a simple majority. Sometimes people are impeached and removed, and it doesn't happen. Congressman named Alcee Hastings impeached as a federal judge and removed it, but they didn't put that prohibition on. He wound up becoming a member of the House. I think but I think you're right. McConnell is basically saying we've got to get rid of if we're going to move. Um, things. McConnell got exactly what he wanted from Donald Trump. He got a rigidly conservative 6-vote Supreme Court. He got like federal judges, many of whom were young and will be there for decades. He's fundamentally reshaped the federal bench for a while. And he got his tax cuts, people, and less regulation. But now, what is Trump? A guy who lost re-election, helped his party lose the Senate, and has just committed, if not impeachable offense, an outrageous bit of behavior that sort of stains the party. I think what McConnell was doing, if he didn't bus, he dragged him out of the middle of the street. And basically, he said to his fellow senators, unlike the first impeachment, where he was very tough, saying nobody vote for conviction, and Romney did. This saying vote your conscience. Do I think he thinks that Trump is actually get convicted? No, because as I say, the numbers seem, once you get past 5 or 6, once you get past Romney, Murkowski, maybe Ben Sass, maybe Susan Collins, maybe Pat Toomey, maybe John Thune. Once you get past 6, it's kind of hard to get more. But the last couple of times we've had impeachments, Clinton didn't have a Democrat again, and Trump only had Ron. So if 5 or 6 Republicans join the Democrats and say, "Yeah, well, this guy committed an offense," it would be a significant political message, and I think McConnell would be happy to see that kind of diversity. Remember, Michael, senators by and large have more freedom than the House members, because House members come from increasingly districts, heavily Democratic, heavily Republican. So for a lot of these Republicans, they're not worried about November, worried about the primary. And Trump is enormously popular. He's had some erosion, but he still has very high approval numbers among Republicans. And these guys from deep districts are not about to play games with their future. Somebody like Ben Sass, somebody like Pat Toomey's not running again, or Murkowski, who once ran and won as an independent after the Republican Party tried to dump her. they got more independence. And so I think you'll see some of them following McConnell's lead.
So, um, one major topic of conversation that's been thrown around a lot, whether it be on daytime television shows like The View or late night political commentator shows, is that there's seems to be a split within the Republican Party, where you can have a Trump America First party emerging from the ashes of the Trump presidency, and you can have the traditional conservative Republican Party, that's for lower taxes, fiscal conservative policy, strong military. Um, I know that the idea, speaking with folks who were alive back then, in during the 1976 primary where Reagan challenged Gerald Ford, that there was thought back then that the Republican Party could split. Reagan, of course, was seen as too conservative of a candidate. Ford was the moderate, but of course that never happened. Is this another one of those scenarios where there's talk or understanding that the party can split, but it doesn't?
Yeah, we hear that on and off, uh, depending on what period you're talking about. But I think even though there's going to be a lot of tension in the Republican Party between the Trumpers, um, and the more old line folks who went along because they didn't really have a choice because the primary for Trump, and said, okay, we'll stay with Trump. He'll give us what we want, the judges, the taxes. Um, but my own feeling is that uh, it's going to be very hard for any Republican to try to, for instance, seek the presidency in 2024 by explicitly saying we've got to move beyond Trump. It's less unlikely because of Trump's behavior the speech, the rah, all of that. But you look at what happened in the House today. There were 10 Republican House members who voted for impeachment, and many of the speeches were full throat defenses of Trump. You guys, you Democrats, just hate him because you hate how well he did, and he, peace in the Middle East and tax cuts and judges and a great economy and all of that. The other thing, the more important thing, and by the way, I apologize for my internet connection. It is what it is. You know, uh, is that every time you hear about, okay, one of these two parties is going to break apart, for that since starting with 1860, that's 160 years. Two parties have been the only two parties that have produced a president. And even when you've had enormous splits, when Teddy Roosevelt, ex-President Roosevelt, had to become president again, the progressive party, when Wallace ran third party in 1968 and won 5 states, it still was temporary. And eventually the parties came back. Just 4 years after 1976, Ronald Reagan took the nomination and wound up winning 44 states and 440 something electoral votes. So uh, whether or not we're in a position now where you're going to genuinely see a split in the sense of an alternative party rising, I'm skeptical. I do think what is more and more folks who represent the Trump leaving, the kind of more traditional Republican, the Rotary, the Chamber of Commerce, kind of one of the most contributors to the Republican Party, has just said they are not giving any contributions to any Republican who voted to not certify the electoral votes. Now, for the Chamber of Commerce to break with the Republicans, to paraphrase John Lee, it's a little like Le Serviteur or Romano attack Pope. You just don't expect that to happen. And you are, I think, going to find some erosion among those Republicans. Now, we think the Chamber of Commerce is going to really be happy with, say, Bernie Sanders as chair of the Budget Committee. You think they're going to sign on for taxes on the wealthy and a couple of $1 trillion worth of stimulus? I'm highly dubious.
So I've heard the argument that it's actually in Democrats' favor that Trump is eligible to run again, to suck all the oxygen out of the room, similar to how he did in 2016, And I kind of see a scenario where there's a big will he, won't he phase during the primary next time. And of course, we're still recovering from 2020. But do you see any validity in that argument that Trump not being convicted, not being prevented from holding high office again, actually benefits the Democratic Party?
You know, if there's one thing we learned, well, we should have learned it many, many elections ago, is just don't make these kinds of assumptions. When Trump was nominated, I don't know anybody except the guy who draws Dilbert who thought Trump. Well, no, I take that back. I was a fellow at the University of Chicago uh, when he started emerging. An Italian journalist said very early, "Trump's going to win," and we all said, "You're crazy." And she said, "I was in it from Sony. I know how the guy who was the same kind of Trump guy. He was constantly being accused of various sexual and political misdeeds. He was prime minister for 10 years." So if you imagine a Biden presidency that runs into serious economic trouble, um, and Trump's not convicted, so he's eligible to run again. The problem, I think, for the people who are skeptics is, so who runs against Trump after all these people, these wannabes, Cruz and Hawley and Nikki Haley and I don't know, I guess Mike Pence uh, or whoever, they've bound themselves to Trump. I think what McConnell was trying to do, and we talked about earlier, was to sort of encourage the Republicans. It's okay to move away from this guy. He's blotted his copybook, as they say in Great Britain. He's not. He's this last thing has made him much less appealing. But anybody who writes off Donald Trump in 2024, assuming he's not serving a prison sentence in New York State, because there's going to be very heavy artillery aimed at him from the Attorney General in New York and the DA in Manhattan. It may well be that the Justice Department has decided that maybe you can't indict a president, but maybe you can indict an ex-president. So if he's facing massive legal problems, yeah, I think it's much too early to say, oh, well, he can't possibly be president again.
So in the Senate right now, it seems as if the drum beats are going towards a situation where Trump could potentially be convicted.
No, I'm sorry.
Oh,
No.
go ahead.
We just talked about that. He
No,
needs 18 Republican senators to convict him. It ain't gonna happen unless McConnell goes 180 degrees the other way, saying we got to get rid of this guy. So
right.
I do not see. Shouldn't have been with you. That's my notion. There are people speculating there might be as many as 2 Republicans to vote for conviction, and at that point you're at 62, and you're still 5 short. But I'm sorry, I
No.
apologize for that. Why don't you finish off?
Oh, and what I meant was that it's less certain than it was during the first impeachment, where he knew that he had unified Republican support. But with folks like Mitt Romney, Mitt Romney was the sole Republican last time that decided to vote in favor. But folks like Ben Sass, Lisa Murkowski saying she had enough. But
I didn't hear. You're back. I'm sorry. You were frozen there for a few minutes when you started the question.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you okay. I don't know. I thought this was going to work better than it is, but let's.
No. We're gonna bear through it.
Okay.
But I was just mentioning Mitt Romney, Ben Sass, Lisa Murkowski recently, the senator from Alaska, saying she had enough. But my question was about the next 2 years in terms of Democratic control. The assumption is that if the Democrats overreach, that's a positive thing for the Republicans for the midterms, because if they're going too much far on the left, they can go back to these traditionally conservative communities and districts that swung blue by a razor-thin margin for Biden this time, and win those places back over to the GOP side. Do you agree, or do you think that the Democrats have a mandate? They should go in with a kind of FDR style emergency. Let's get all the legislation we can for now out the way, besides COVID relief.
Well, I think it's a question of being careful about what we mean by going left versus centrist. For instance, I think there's probably um, a pretty broad support for some kind of bold investment policy, for infrastructure, for getting money out there. You have some Republicans. I mean, Hawley was on this case before he got into all of this mess with the certification, saying he the problem with what's happened to blue collar work and inequality and wages. And I think that's, in fact, an approach where you could go left economically and not risk what you're talking about, not risk a backlash. The real backlash, I think, comes from things like identity politics. After the November election, when Democrats lost 10 House seats, there was a very angry phone hookup among Democrat members. Big, angry arguments between the centrists and folks like AOC, who represent the progressives, with AOC saying you just didn't organize right, you know how to use the tools, and they're saying no, if you cannot come into a district line and argue beat the police, it's poison. That may be a area where you might conflict. But I think there's a chance for Biden to say to at least part of blue collar whites, assuming that racism is not driving all of their voting, say, you have been screwed by the system in terms of decent jobs. I want to see if we can get some of those. But you are right, in a 50-50 Senate, the most conservative Democrat, who's Joe Manchin from West Virginia, has a whole lot of power. He's already said, forget court packing. I will not vote to expand the Supreme Court. And then you're not going to find, I think, any Republican who's going to sign on to that. So even though they have a 50-50 with Kamala Harris a majority, if one Democrat like Manchin says, nope, not going to do it. And by the way, forget the legislative filibuster. He's not entirely against that, but he's very skeptical. And I do think that the Democrats are going to have to deal with the fact that with a guy like Manchin, with senators like John Tester from Montana, that's a very red state. He barely won last time. Sinema and Mark Kelly, both from Arizona, relatively moderate Democrats. Yeah, there's going to have to be some very careful political strategizing to figure out how to keep that bare majority together.
So, with the recent revelation of the PGA of America dropping Trump for the 2022 tournament, and him being banned from Twitter, it seems as if he's not as strong a potential candidate as he would have been had this situation last week not happened. In your mind, does this put more gasoline on the fire for those who feel as if this election has been rigged? Or do you think that this actually weakens him because he can no longer use the platform that he traditionally did for 4 years or 5 years since he was a candidate to spew out these conspiracies, to whip up animosity and anger at the system and the deep state?
Well, to the first point, I mean, I think for Trump, losing the PGA is much worse than impeachment, because he doesn't care about government or politics, but God, does he care about golf? And taking the PGA away from him is like, I can't think of a worse fate for him. The action of all of these companies has triggered among defenders a very strong pushback, saying this is the deep state in action. Just what we told you. These are the big companies that the Democrats money from, and some of them. This is Twitter, and it's Facebook, and it's Instagram, and it's they're doing this to silence Trump and his allies. And that argument's going to play. It's basically all Fox News was talking about, I think, in the last couple of days. But it is also going to weaken him. I mean, Trump had 88 million followers on Twitter. and it was his primary tool. It was a perfectly effective device because there were no mediating institutions. He didn't have to have somebody analyze it. I think that is going to, depending on how long this lasts, that's going to make him a little bit weaker. But I also think it's going to increase the belief on the part of Trump's most earnest supporters that this is a deep conspiracy by powerful financial institutions. You know, one was that Deutsche Bank, which has basically been the only bank that fund Trump's enterprise over the last several years, has said no more. And Trump has a lot of loans coming due in the next year. So you're right to point to these different places that make it more difficult to function in the coming years he used to. But it's also true that it may make him, on the part of his supporters, a martyr. Look what these big shots have done to him.
And in the same vein, I was looking at an ABC News report, that a 538 report that released that 52% of the American public are in favor of removal of President Trump in light of the impeachment proceeding that happened today. In addition, going back to 1974, during the Richard Nixon, I guess then ongoing impeachment before he resigned, 57% approved of removal. But in retrospect, since then, there's been more of a positive light given to Nixon, knowing that yes, Watergate happened, but he also reopened China. He was behind a lot of initial policies that Democrats support today, like the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency. Do you think that down the road Trump's legacy will forever be marred, or do you think there is some kind of opening for folks to look at him in a more favorable light than they do right now?
That's a really good question because there's always a constant reappraisal of presidents. It never stops. When I was in college, Woodrow Wilson was kind of honored as the first progressive president. And over time, it turns out that, among other things, he was a stone cold racist who segregated Washington. And, his reputation has taken a deserved hit. And yeah, what Bill Clinton said, I think, around Nixon's funeral, he said, so you don't judge anybody by the worst days of their lives. Trump may be a challenge to that because there were many. But I noticed in today's New York Times, there is a piece about the economy that says Trump got this right. That is, he was the guy who said, we don't have to have a lot of high unemployment to fight inflation. We can actually keep interest rates low, and there'll be, at least till the pandemic, relatively low unemployment and virtually no inflation. So I think you're going to see stuff like that when you can get past Trump's persona and his character and his temperament and say, okay, well, let's take a deep breath and see what did they do. Now, there's going to be also some pretty harsh judgments about, the basic destruction of the structure of government, what he did to the environmental policies and on regulation. But yeah, that's inevitable that as the time fades, there'll be a reappraisal.
And so, one thing I was thinking of since, the Capitol building was stormed last week was that there seems to be now all of a sudden, with only a few days left before Trump leaves office, bipartisan acknowledgement of wrongdoing by Trump himself. The speakers on the House floor didn't seem to have a consistent message. Some were saying this is another gimmick to try to attack Trump. Some were saying we need unity. Someone else was saying this is hypocritical because, if you had called out more riotous protesters like what they call Black Lives Matter and other groups, it wouldn't lead to what we experienced on the Capitol last week. There was, a wide array of arguments made on the Republican side. But in terms of, I guess what I'm asking is, in terms of, what we've seen so far in this presidency, Charlottesville, him saying, calling countries like Haiti S-hole countries, a Muslim ban, bullying a Gold Star family, the comments he made about John McCain, the immigration policies where children were locked in cages. All of these things seem to warrant to the level of deserving the same kind of outrage or bipartisan support. But what do you think made this one so special? Was it just the timing, uh, being that Biden is just days away from being the next commander in chief, or do you think there was something more to that?
No, I think what made this different was the Capitol was sacked and we almost had a massacre there. I mean, it was a level of shock that went through the whole system that we'd never seen before. Insulting John McCain and making racist or racist or homophobic or misogynist statements is obnoxious. But we were in a situation here where there's this one Capitol Police officer, Eugene Goodman, who literally saved us from a massacre. He goaded the riot following him upstairs away from the door and right onto the Senate floor. And had he not done that, I think you would have seen a number of dead senators. And I'm not exaggerating. That's a wholly different level of her. You can compare to Charlotte in that there was a march, there was violence, there was a woman killed by a guy driving a car. But that event broadcast on live television, was so jaw dropping that you had a number of people say, Trump supporters say, the scales fell from my eyes. I didn't understand that he could be so reckless, and so just so unbelievably self-centered as to bring thousands of people to Washington. Well, he didn't say go destroy the Capitol. He set the table for that, and I think that's a pretty different thing than the history that you recited. Look, any one of those things. When McCain was insulted by Trump, like first day of his campaign, I said, "Well, that's it. He's finished. You can't do that. The American hero, the 2000, he's done." Well, no. And then when he when those Access Hollywood tapes came out of what he said what he could do to women, you had the chairman of Trump saying, "You got to get the ticket. He can't survive." We saw him survive 4 years. This was different, and it was literally blood on the floor, and it could have been an unthinkable catastrophe. It was just a little bit different scenario play. So I think that explains a lot of why even some of the people who voted against impeachment got up and said, "I can't defend what Trump said." Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader in the House, said he bears responsibility. And then you did have his all-out defenders, the Jim Jordans, the Louis Gomez, who this is all about the debate and what about Hunter Biden and what about Clinton's emails and what about all of that. But it did the party that nothing else had.
So, Mr. Greenfield, if you were President-elect Biden, going into your first term as president, knowing that there's so many people out there who are who believe that your election was illegitimate, despite lack of evidence, and despite Trump's own court-appointed judges throwing a lot of these lawsuits out because they were meritless, how do you govern in this environment? Even though you have a razor-thin majority, how do you go forward and govern to get your message across, to provide stability that people are yearning for, and to also set forth your agenda for the next 4 years in this kind of toxic environment?
I begin with an inaugural address. I'm going to try to that is very from the typical address. We're sort of very flowery. All be together. Look at our great history, and we'll move. You have to own that if not anything interferes through itself. But in his speech, he laid out very clearly how dire the situation was and how important it was to take very important action. I think that he has to strike a unity. He's got to say that because you have to say some of that if you're president. But to say, this is what we have to do now, and not do it in flowery rhetoric and say one famous lines from FDR's 1933 inaugural was, "Our primary purpose is to put people to work." And people understood, and Biden almost has to be that direct. We have got to keep people in their homes. We have got to not have evictions. And who suffered the most from this? The last jobs report was that I think there were 140,000 jobs lost, all of them by women, predominantly Black and Latino. Now, it's tricky to talk in open, honest racial terms in this country. It's a what Gunnar Myrdal called the American dilemma. But in this case, I think Biden can at least say, the people who were least well off before this pandemic have suffered the most, and we've got to get help for them now. And that's the kind of approach people always talk about Winston Churchill, how he was the wartime leader of Great Britain. If you read Churchill's speeches, they are very, very blunt, and he always begins by telling you how tough things are. We had a horrible week last week. Or in Dunkirk, we had one of the worst military disasters in the history of Europe, because people believed that he was being straight with them. So that when he said, "Here's what we can do," they said, "Oh, okay. There's no BS going on here," and that's what I think Biden really has to do. He has to be as blunt and as clear, and he has to not talk quite so much as he likes to.
So Speaker Pelosi, shortly before we went live, had released a statement indicating that the investigation trial cannot realistically take place in a fast track pace before Biden gets into office. But do you see that? Do you see a trial going on simultaneously during the early days of a Biden presidency, actually damaging Biden's legislation?
That's the $64,000 question, as they say. We know that the trial's not going to happen immediately. McConnell's already said not going to do that. But it is a fair question. Was the best case for not doing this was, if what you just asked is relevant, how does Biden set the table early? Does he really want an impeachment trial to go on, say, 30 days into his administration? Tough. I know we're live, Michael. I think we need to wrap up another 5 or 10 minutes if we could, because I've got a deadline. Okay.
Sure, definitely. And so in the last, wrapping up here, I want to pivot a little bit to your book, If Kennedy Lived. Very interesting book. So much to dive into, but specifically, I wanted to get into the Cuban Missile Crisis because you indicated that that period really changed Kennedy as a candidate. He campaigned in 1960 as a hawk, but came out of that, that brief brush with potential nuclear war with the Soviet Union, with a newfound perspective on foreign policy. In the book that Bob Woodward has written, Rage, he indicated that during September 25th, the U.S. command flew a simulated air attack, sending B-1 bombers and some 20 other planes. And this is during the 2017 year. And, this back and forth between nuclear testing, really coming close to the coastal lines of both North Korea and the United States, really brought us to the brink of nuclear war, even though the public was not really aware of the extent of how much this testing was going on. Trump himself had said we were really close, according to Bob Woodward. And he seemed to be a little shaken by that. Do you see any similarities in the way both men came out of these situations? Do you see Trump change?
I can't speak to the Trump thing at all. I just can't. So let me take the question in a somewhat direction. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think Kennedy was a basic change guy. He had skepticism about the military, all the way going back to Day of Pigs. But when he heard that, people like Curtis LeMay and Chief basically to take out the missile, don't worry about it, and realize that they could put a nuclear war, came out of that with much more skepticism about the military and a kind that we've got to pull back, which is why in June of 1963 he made a speech at a university saying, "We've got to do something with this Cold War. We can't gamble with the lives of millions." It's why he signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And in my book, what I object is he would have found a way not to escalate the war in Vietnam. He would not have relied on the military saying, "Oh, don't worry, we just need 100,000 more troops and we'll take care of this." He had been so burned by them, and he knew that area, having gone there as a young man, that he said, "No, I've got to find some way to get out of this, but politically it's tricky." What you are talking about is that there have been any number of times when we've come very close to accidental nuclear war, Cuban Missile Crisis, the incident with Trump. There were cases where a Soviet military guy mistook a flock of geese for incoming U.S. bombers and was getting ready to send the signal, and then said, "Well, maybe I better take a beat." So we've had a lot of those close calls, unfortunately.
My last question for the night, sir. Do you had described that both Bobby and Jack Kennedy were really cautious about a particular candidate in '64. It wasn't Goldwater, but it was Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, because he represented someone in the Midwest. Yeah, he was a Midwest governor. He was not a Catholic. He was I think he was an evangelical, or no, he was a Mormon. Yeah, Mormon. He was someone that appealed to a lot of African Americans. I think he was going to eat away at Jack Kennedy's African American support. Being that he specifically fit those kind of criteria, are there any candidates now, even in this early period, that you think would demographically, politically serve as Biden's worst nightmare as a candidate, as a potential opponent?
Uh, I just think it's off early, and also we're still going to have to deal with the fallout of January 6th and how Trump emerges. If you're assuming that Trump disappears as a candidate, one thing I do think is that there are very popular Republican governors in Massachusetts, in Vermont, in Maryland, but there's not a chance in the world that they could be the nominee because they're all pro-choice, and that's just off the table. And there's this fantasy, that that's if they only have a moderate Republican, the Republican Party is not. They may not nominate a Trumper, but they're not nominating a moderate. It's just not the case. So if you leave them out, I'll tell you one person who kind of a little intrigues me. I haven't been thinking about this, but I appreciate your question because now I have to think about this. Is Tim Scott, senator from South Carolina? He's been elected to 2 terms. He was the first black senator from the South since Reconstruction. He's a conservative Republican. He is not a kind of Trump, QAnon, whatever. And yeah, I would think that the Republican Party nominating a African American, given the fact that Biden owes his presidency in every sense to the African American vote, started in South Carolina, and then just take a look at the state he carried. I'll leave you with this: a total of 42,000 votes in 3 states, Georgia, Wisconsin, and I think Nevada, is all that's separate this election from an electoral tie going into the House. 42,000 out of 160 million. Do I think that Tim Scott could conceivably eat into enough of Biden's African American support, and not just, but also among the kind of white collar college graduate Republicans who fled Trump? So thank you. This was that I should probably send you a little money if I write this and I get paid for this, Michael. That's a really interesting. And I apologize again for the internet connections. We soldiered on mostly, and I also have to say I'm pretty damn impressed that a guy who's still in law school is pulling together a podcast like this. It's why I agreed to come on. I thought, I don't know. I won't be around in 25 or 30 years, but I have a hunch you will be in a way that people will notice. So thank you for having me, and most best of luck to you.
Mr. Greenfield, thank you. It's been an honor, sir. I just want to thank you again for joining the Political Mic. It's been truly a pleasure to talk politics with you. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and conclude this podcast, episode 25 of the Political Mic. Thank you and have a good night.
Okay.